We're going to look at an example form that implements a workflow involving an employer and an employee who needs to submit information to a government office. Let's jump right in. The employer starts the process by filling out their section of the form. To keep things simple here, we just have a single field, the company name. Then the employer can choose whether they want to fill out the information about the employee themselves or if they prefer to delegate this to the employee. If they choose to fill it out themselves, then the employee section shows. They can enter the information about the employee, which in this case is just the employee first and last name. And then the employer submits the form. Now, the more interesting case is of course the one where the employer decides that the employee will fill out their own section. So we have two people working together to fill out this form. Let's get back to our empty form. Have the employer fill out their own section. And this time, they will enter the email address of the employee. The employer submits the form, and now an email is sent to the employee. Let's pretend we're the employee and look at this email we received. We're told here that your employer, Acme, requested that you fill out the employee section of the following form. All right, let's click on this link. We're taken to the form and we can see the information the employer entered, which shows here as read-only. We can enter our own information, so let's do that. And we submit the form. All right, that's the workflow. Now, let's see how this is implemented in Form Builder. In Form Builder, we can see both sections, and in each section, all the fields are visible here. So we see everything. But of course, at runtime, certain fields and or even entire sections can be hidden, or some things can be shown as read-only, as we just saw a minute ago. Let's look at an example to see how this is done. We want this email field to only be shown if the employer chose no to this question, right? If they chose yes, then they intend to fill out the whole form, and in that case, we don't need to ask them about the employee email address. This question is given a name, which we can see by opening the control settings for this field. And here we can see that the name is fill-employee-section. Now, opening the control settings for our email field, let's go under Formulas, Visibility, and we here declare that the email field should only be visible if the answer to that fill-employee-section is no. Now let's hit test, and we can see that something similar happens with the employee section down here. Now we know that the visibility of fields and section can depend on the value of other fields, but it can also depend on something called the workflow stage. Now, what are workflow stages? You define as a form author what the possible stages are for a given form. At the beginning, when a user starts filling out a new form, there is no workflow stage defined. Sometimes we say that at this point, the workflow stage is empty. In addition to this empty stage, in this example, we have two more stages. The stage called employer-only corresponds to the employer being done with the first section and having left the employee to fill out the second section. And finally, the stage called employer-and-employee corresponds to both sections being filled out. The arrows in this diagram corresponds to the stage changing, and depending on the choice made by the employer at the beginning, we can go to employer only or directly to employer and employee. We've seen that the visibility of fields and sections can depend on the value of other fields, but it can also depend on the current workflow stage. For instance, the employee section should only be editable in the initial stage. So when we are at employer only, and the employer is done and the employee is filling out their own section, then the employer section should be read-only. And of course, when both sections have been filled out and the form has been maybe submitted to the government, we most likely want everything to be read-only. So the first section should pretty much always be read-only, this unless the workflow stage is empty. Back in Form Builder, this is done in that section settings where we say that the section is read-only if the workflow stage isn't empty. Now, let's see how those stage transitions work. They always happen when users click on buttons at the bottom of the form. And if you remember our form at runtime, in this example, we always have just one button, which is the submit button. So we want to say that if the workflow stage is empty and the employer is not also filling out the employee section, then we want to send an email to the employee and set that workflow stage to employer only. Otherwise, we want to set it to employer and employee. This is defined here in this logic, which does exactly what we just said. If the workflow stage is empty and the employer is not filling out the employee section, then we want to send an email to the employee and set the workflow stage to employer only. Otherwise, we set it to employer and employee. Now, let's backtrack a little bit. What you see here is defined in a configuration file. In that file, you can define what buttons to show for your form. So here we say that for the form gov application, which is the name of our form, we only want the submit button. When the user clicks on the submit button, the submit process runs. You often start a submit process with require uploads, as if you have any upload field in your form. Since uploads happen in the background, when the user does submit, we want to first wait for all the files to be sent to the server. Once this is done, the process continues and we get to validate all, which makes sure that all the fields are valid. So again, if anything is invalid, the user will see an error. They will need to fix the problem and try to submit the form again. Next, we have the logic we saw earlier, which is the interesting part as far as we're concerned here. And finally, we save the data in the database and show a confirmation page to the user. There you go. In case you want to try this yourself, the source for those properties as well as the source of the form is linked from the comment section below. And I hope you found this useful.